There is a phrase that's often repeated in PvP that annoys the hell out of me. You can't heal when you're dead. While in itself it is true, it is used to excuse the ineffective, overly tanky setups that make up the majority of the PvP healing builds you'll find in online guides and in-game. This mentality is pervasive and I don't really know where it comes from. I assume it's battleground healers, but even in that context, your heals need to count for something. What players do when they build too defensively is that they are taking all of that extra resistance and tankiness away from their healing prowess and utility. Outside of very particular situations, this is a counterproductive way of building a PvP healer. I would in fact encourage all aspiring PvP healers to stop trying to be tanks. Let's just break down what people mean when they say that you can't heal when you're dead. They want to build a lot of tankiness into a healer with the excuse that they must stay alive at any cost because when you are dead you do 0 HPS. So they max out their resistances, wear 1 or even 2 tank sets, run a sword and board back bar, you get the idea. And they do this to a point where they don't generate much healing even when they are alive. When you play a healer, you generally want your healing to get your teammates up to full health in a burst heal or 2, and you can't really do that if you sacrifice all your healing power just to be as tanky as possible. You can do this if you are a max HP warden running Polar Wind, but with Polar Wind hitting just yourself and an ally, it is not an ideal skill to run as a healer in bigger groups. You ever wonder why DDs and PvP groups never create builds led by the notion that you can't deal damage when you're dead? Because everyone immediately notices it when you are not killing anyone. And if you're a healer building by this principle, odds are you are not really healing anyone either. My point is that it should not be the sole purpose of a healing build to not die. Of course you will want to avoid death as much as possible, but if you overdo it to a point where all you can do is tank a bunch of players, you are a parsing dummy more than you are a healer. And you don't really bring anything to the table for your group other than being a distraction. One that is rather easy to ignore at that. As with PvE, a healer's job in PvP is not limited to keeping people alive. You can also add a huge amount of extra utility through support sets such as Powerful Assault, Spell Power Cure, Pillager's Profit, and many more. If your build is only intended to keep yourself alive and you run 1 or even 2 tank sets, you are forfeiting a huge part of what makes it worth bringing a healer in the first place. In some cases you will be under so much pressure that you need a more selfish setup, but in that case I would always opt for a sustained set like Wretched Vitality rather than a full tank set. Stacking a bunch of resistances isn't even the most reliable way to avoid death. Sustain and mobility are vital aspects of survivability on any build, and you could say that out-healing incoming damage is, by itself, a form of mitigation. What's interesting to note here is that debuffs to armor are much more common in Cyrodiil than debuffs to healing. I took a recent log as an example and compared the uptimes of armor and healing debuffs on our group's players. On average, our players were twice as likely to have the armor debuff Minor Breach on them compared to the healing debuff Minor Defile. When we compare the major versions of these debuffs, we can even see that Major Breach is more than 10 times as likely to occur as Major Defile. The problem grows when you take into account the armor penetration that many players will have. Nightblades running Balorg and Sorgs running Shattered Fate are quite common after all. Some players might draw the conclusion that you will therefore need to stack as much resistance as possible to offset all these common debuffs and counters to high resist builds. And while that's definitely one way of going about things, you can also wonder whether it is worth sacrificing the entire point of your build, in this case healing, to mitigate incoming damage in a way that is so easily compromised. And even with a good chunk of resistances, facing a Warden with 500 Balorg and Deep Fissure might still mean you're fighting practically naked. In my view, maxed out resistances are not worth it when we have a much more effective source of tankiness, cross-healing. Cross-healing is a term commonly used to describe the phenomenon where players in the same group heal each other. More specifically, it tends to refer to the sharing of heal over time abilities such as Echoing Vigor and Radiating Regeneration. There's a reason why ball groups and small scales alike invest so much in cross-healing. Cross-healing adds a constant buffer of incoming heals that offsets the incoming damage in a way that cannot easily be countered. As we have seen, minor defile and especially major defile are extremely rare in PvP, meaning that there is actually very little chance that this constant stream of incoming heals will be compromised, making it a much more stable and therefore reliable source of tankiness. Because yes, these heals do in effect make you tanky, just rather than negating a portion of the incoming damage like resistances do, they compensate some or all of the incoming damage through constant healing ticks. And in most group compositions, this will be the more reliable way of mitigating damage. Another possible issue caused by a selfish build philosophy is that it may affect your adaptability down the line. In my experience, in the vast majority of cases, you are survivable enough as a healer when you have access to minor and major resolve and are wearing anywhere between 1 and 3 heavy armor pieces. You may indeed be able to tank more damage if you take a tank set such as Pariah or Ethereal Ascension into the equation. But in practice, all these sets do is increase your own margin for error. Bad positioning, bad resource management and slow reaction times are less likely to be punished immediately, and these bad habits may become a regular fixture in your gameplay. When you do then want to join a higher end group, you may be asked to run 2 support sets and rely on clever positioning and mobility to survive. If you've never learned how to do that, it'll be a rude awakening. And if you are allowed to cling to your tanky setup in such a group, you will get massively outperformed by healers running more optimized healing builds. One excuse to build healers tanky that I keep hearing is that healers will always get targeted. While this may be true to an extent for Battlegrounds, it is not so much in Cyrodiil. Usually the only players who will even take active notice of who the healer is are organized groups. And in most scenarios, such groups will target the biggest chunks of players to ulti dump. Playing a healer gives us the luxury that we do not need to be a part of that big chunk. We'll just need to keep our allies within reach of our heals, and we don't need to be standing inside the group unless we are recasting Echoing Vigor. I see the results of this approach in many logs, where I can compare my damage taken to that of my DD allies, and I nearly always take considerably less damage over a run than they do. Sometimes the difference is in the millions in my favor. Even if you do get targeted as a healer, as long as you have good cross heals in your group, it should not actually matter that much, as that buffer of incoming heals will give you enough time to blend into the group and lose the pressure. I have heard the healers get targeted mantra multiple times in Cyrodiil groups, and often the logs would reveal afterwards that those players were just standing in the wrong place too much of the time. Building tankier would not even have saved them, and if it had, it would have been a cover for weak points in their gameplay, which ultimately doesn't help the player nor the group. When I play a healer, I always try to match the tankiness and survivability of the rest of my group. If everyone's running a 45k health Arcanist with strong self-heals, I need to build a completely self-sufficient healer lest I get singled out. Then again, that often makes me reach a point where I don't think bringing a full healer is even worth it. When I play with a group, I always insist that everyone at least run Echoing Vigor instead of the other, more selfish morph. This adds a huge amount of survivability to the group that also allows me to build my healer in a much more effective way, which in turn exponentially increases the survivability of the entire group. Stacking resistances can work, but it requires a particular group setup to be the better option, and it shouldn't be taken as the golden standard for healing builds, especially considering that the value of resistances fluctuates a lot depending on who you are fighting, which makes it a less reliable source of tankiness than good cross heals. On a more subjective note, I also think it's way more fun to play a healer when you can do huge amounts of actual healing that can keep the entire group alive, instead of having to spam self heals as you're being parsed on by a Zerg. If you want to play like that, then by all means do so, but do not for a second believe the idea that as a healer you need to have maximum resistances, vamp 3 and a tank set in order to do a good job. These guidelines only apply in a small minority of cases and should not be taken as the default option for building a healer. If you want to get an idea of how I build my healers, watch my recent video of my Sorcerer healing build for update 41. I think this should be the standard way to build a healer for most content, while reserving the tankier options for specific group compositions and possibly battlegrounds. I am planning to dip my feet into battlegrounds a bit more and maybe make a build for that, so stay tuned. Until then, see you on the battlefield.